A castle under siege was a slow-moving masterpiece of terror. Forget the simple image of a log smashing a gate. Medieval siege warfare was a brutal chess game where kingdoms rose and fell not just on battlefields, but in a silent war of engineering, starvation, and nerve. This was a world of hidden mechanics and forgotten strategies that decided who lived, who ruled, and whose history would be written. By the end, you will understand the true, intricate horror and genius behind these Stone Age standoffs. How did a simple ditch become a death trap for an army? What dark innovation turned fire into a weapon that could not be put out? The fate of entire cultures often hung on the secrets locked within these walls. What does it truly take to break an unbreakable will? That chess game had one ultimate, brutal checkmate. The goal was almost never to physically reduce the castle to dust. It was to break the will of the people inside. A commander's dream was a peaceful surrender, a gate swinging open without a single drop of blood being shed on his side. This single, simple objective to force capitulation dictated every single move in the siege playbook. It created a strange, tense economy of time, resources, and human endurance. For the defenders, their currency was the food in their storerooms and the hope in their hearts. For the attackers, it was the patience of their own army and the supplies stretching back over miles of vulnerable countryside. Every tactic, from the grandest trebuchet to the quietest whispered rumor, was an investment in this economy, designed to make the enemy's balance sheet crash before your own did. This fundamental dynamic meant the real battle was often invisible, fought in the grumbling of hungry soldiers and the anxious glances of townsfolk watching their grain sacks shrink. It was a war of nerves where the strongest stone walls in the world were useless if the mines behind them cracked first. To break that will, an attacker first had to understand the mind of the stone itself. The castles of the High Middle Ages were not just big houses with tall walls. They were three-dimensional puzzles of defense, each feature a calculated response to a previous failure, a living blueprint of medieval paranoia. The evolution was constant. Early motte and bailey forts of earth and timber gave way to immense structures of stone, not for grandeur, but because fire and battering rams had taught a brutal lesson. The primary shield was the curtain wall, a sheer, daunting face of masonry often 10 feet thick or more. Its height was psychological warfare, a clear message to any approaching army about the scale of the task ahead. But a simple wall is just a target. The genius was in the details that made it active. Towers were not just lookout posts, they were projecting strong points called flanking towers placed at intervals along the wall. From these towers, defenders could rain down arrows and stones along the length of the wall's base, a zone called the dead ground that would otherwise be a blind spot. Anyone trying to scale the wall or mine its foundation would find themselves caught in a lethal crossfire from two directions, a tactic that turned a linear barrier into a killing field. The weakest point was always the gate, and so it became the most fortified. The gatehouse evolved into a miniature castle unto itself, a deadly bottleneck designed to trap and dismantle any force bold enough to try and rush it. Thick, iron-studded doors were just the beginning. Behind them often lay a portcullis, a heavy iron grating that could be dropped instantly to split an attacking party. The passage through the gatehouse was long, dark, and narrow, with small openings in the ceiling known as murder holes. From these holes, defenders could drop rocks, pour boiling water, or worse, onto anyone trapped below. It was a gauntlet of concentrated terror, and at the heart of it all stood the keep, the final redoubt. This was the castle's last stand, a towering stronghold within the stronghold where the lord and his garrison could retreat if the outer walls fell. It housed the well, the main storerooms, and the living quarters, designed to withstand a siege on its own. Every feature, from the sloping plinth at the base of a wall to deter miners, to the narrow arrow slits that gave defenders a wide field of fire while presenting a tiny target, spoke of a single, relentless purpose: to multiply the cost of attack, to delay, to demoralize, and to outlast. Understanding this anatomy is crucial because every one of these defensive answers would soon meet its equally ingenious and often terrifying question. But before a single stone of that mighty curtain wall could be touched, an army had to face the castle's first and most cunning line of defense, one built not from stone but from the earth itself. This was the realm of the ditch, the berm, and the glacis, a landscape deliberately sculpted into a treacherous obstacle course. We often picture a moat filled with water, but the primary purpose of this trench was far more fundamental. Whether dry or water-filled, the ditch was a giant gash in the earth, carved out right at the base of the castle walls. Its depth and width were calculated with cruel precision. The goal was to create a distance so great that the most feared weapon of the age, the siege tower, could never bridge the gap. These rolling wooden fortresses, designed to let attackers rush onto the battlements, were rendered useless if their drawbridge could not reach the wall. The ditch also served as a stark barrier against the most covert threat, the sapper. Miners trying to tunnel under the foundations now had to start their dark work from the bottom of a deep pit, under constant observation and attack from the walls above, a task that was both demoralizing and deadly. The earth dug from the ditch was not wasted. It was piled on the castle side to form a raised bank called a berm. This berm did two critical things. First, it added mass and stability to the base of the stone wall, making it even harder to undermine. Second, it created a steep, unstable slope that any attacker scrambling out of the ditch would have to climb, all while exposed to arrow fire. In more advanced designs, this concept was refined into the glacis, a long, smooth, stone-paved slope that angled away from the wall. The glacis was a work of diabolical genius. Its smooth surface offered no cover, no handhold for ladders, and it cleverly deflected incoming projectiles from catapults upward and over the wall, rather than letting them strike head-on. These earthenworks transformed the ground around the castle into a weapon. They turned a direct assault into a slow, exhausting, and exposed crawl, buying the defenders precious time and forcing the attackers to expend immense effort before the real fight had even begun. It was a silent, static guard that asked a simple, costly question of every approaching soldier: how much are you willing to risk just to get to the starting line? That silent, earthen guard demanded a response, and the castle's lord had won long before the first enemy banner appeared on the horizon. Preparing for a siege was not a frantic last-minute scramble. It was a deliberate, methodical playbook executed in the eerie calm before the storm, a race against an unseen clock. The most critical calculation was not of weapons but of sustenance. A castle's true strength was measured in bushels of grain, barrels of salted meat, and the depth of its well. Stockpiling enough food to feed hundreds of people for months, sometimes over a year, was a monumental logistical feat. Every storeroom was packed to the rafters, and careful rationing plans were drawn up. The well was inspected and cleaned. For a castle with strong walls but no water was a death sentence written in stone. Simultaneously, the physical defenses were hardened to a razor's edge. Masons swarmed over the walls, repairing even the smallest cracks. Carpenters reinforced gates and hoardings, those wooden overhangs on the battlements that allowed defenders to drop objects directly downward. Then the landscape itself was weaponized. In a practice called clearing the ground, every tree, every building, every scrap of cover for several hundred yards around the castle was systematically removed. This created a barren, open kill zone where approaching troops were utterly exposed. It also denied the enemy vital timber for building their siege engines and fires. Within the walls, society shifted to a wartime footing. The garrison, a mix of professional knights and levied men-at-arms, was mustered and drilled relentlessly. But the defenders were not just soldiers. Every able-bodied person, from blacksmiths to bakers, had a role. Women and older children prepared bandages, maintained the food stores, and even helped in pouring heated substances during an assault. This mobilization created a powerful, shared purpose. The psychological preparation was just as vital. The Lord would give speeches reinforcing the righteousness of their cause and the certainty of relief from allies. He had to project unshakable confidence, for morale was a resource as precious as grain. A community that believed it could outlast the enemy was a fortress within a fortress. When the watchman finally shouted the dreaded alert and the horizon darkened with approaching men, the castle was not caught off guard. It was a coiled spring, a self-contained world of steel, stone, and stubborn human spirit, waiting for the first move in the deadly game to begin. The coiled spring inside the castle walls now met its match in a different kind of patience. The most common and most grueling form of siege was not a dramatic assault, but a slow, deliberate encirclement known as the investment or blockade. An attacking commander, faced with those formidable walls and ditches, would often choose to avoid a direct, costly fight. Instead, he would draw a ring of steel and earth around the entire fortress. His army would construct a continuous line of trenches, wooden palisades, and fortified camps, creating an impassable cordon. The goal was simple and suffocating: to sever the castle from the outside world completely. Every road was watched, every forest path patrolled. No cart of grain could enter, no messenger could slip out, and no flock of sheep could be brought to pasture. The castle was transformed from a bastion into a sealed bottle, its inhabitants trapped with only the resources they had stored inside. This was a war of attrition, a grim contest of endurance where time itself was the primary weapon. For the defenders, the blockade turned their greatest strength, their self-sufficiency, into a ticking clock. Each day, the carefully measured stores of food and water dwindled. Morale, that invisible fortress, began to erode as the reality of their isolation set in. They could only watch from the battlements as the enemy's campfires twinkled in the night, a constant reminder of the unyielding ring around them. But maintaining this stranglehold was a monumental challenge for the attackers as well. An army sitting still for months was a vulnerable and expensive entity. They had to feed thousands of soldiers and laborers, which meant protecting their own long, winding supply lines from raids by friendly forces trying to relieve the castle. Disease could sweep through cramped, unsanitary camps, claiming more lives than any arrow. The boredom and restlessness of soldiers, promised a swift campaign but stuck in muddy trenches for a season, was a constant threat to discipline. Both sides were locked in a silent, exhausting stalemate, each waiting for the other to break first from hunger, disease, or sheer despair. The blockade was a test of logistics and will, where the true battlefield was the stomach and the human spirit, proving that sometimes the most powerful siege engine was simply a waiting game. Yet that waiting game could only stretch so far. When patience wore thin or a swift victory was demanded, the siege escalated into a thunderous dialogue of timber and stone. This was the artillery duel, where armies brought their own artificial mountains to the fight. The most iconic of these engines were the trebuchet and the mangonel, often lumped together as catapults, but they were machines of profoundly different genius. The mangonel was the older design, a massive torsion weapon. Its power came from tightly wound ropes of sinew or hair, creating immense rotational force. When released, a single arm would snap forward, slinging a projectile in a relatively low, flat arc. It was powerful and rapid firing, ideal for targeting defenders on walls or for smashing wooden structures inside the fortress. But for the ultimate task of breaking stone, engineers developed a more elegant and devastating solution, the counterweight trebuchet. This machine was a study in leveraged power. Imagine a giant seesaw. On the short end hung a massive box filled with tons of earth or stone, the counterweight. On the long, sling-equipped arm was the projectile. To fire it, crews would winch down the long arm, raising the colossal counterweight high into the air. At the moment of release, gravity took over. the counterweight plunged downward, whipping the long arm upward with breathtaking force, hurling its payload in a high, arcing trajectory perfect for crashing down onto towers or sailing over walls. It was slower but far more powerful than the mangonel, capable of launching stones weighing hundreds of pounds. The primary purpose of these engines was structural, to batter and breach, to reduce towering symbols of security to crumbling rubble. But their utility was darker and more psychological. They were also delivery systems for terror. Siege engines could hurl more than just stone. Incendiary projectiles, bundles of flaming pitch and tar, were used to set roofs and stores alight within the fortress, creating chaos and consuming precious resources. In a grim chapter of siegecraft, armies sometimes resorted to biological attacks, launching the remains of animals or other materials over the walls in an attempt to spread illness among the densely packed defenders. This was a crude and horrific form of pressure, aiming to break the body to break the spirit. So while the thunder of impact shook the ground, the true target of these flying shadows was often the morale of those watching from the ramparts, a constant reminder that nowhere inside their walls was truly safe. But the artillery duel was a conversation across distance. To truly breach a fortress, you had to walk right up to its door and knock with terrifying force. This brings us to the battering ram, an instrument so often reduced in our minds to a simple log carried by a few men. In reality, it was a masterpiece of protected engineering, a mobile siege workshop known as a penthouse or a so. This was not just a roof on wheels, it was a long, sturdy timber shed, often covered in fresh, wet hides or earth to protect against fire and to cushion the impact of stones dropped from above. Inside this dark, claustrophobic tunnel, safe from arrows and boiling water, a team of soldiers would operate the ram itself, and the ram was rarely just a tree trunk. It was an engineered beam, sometimes iron-capped, suspended from the roof of the shed by chains or ropes. This suspension was the key to its power. By swinging the ram like a pendulum, the crew could generate tremendous, rhythmic force with far less effort than simply running forward with a log. They would rock it back and forth, building momentum until the iron head slammed into its target with a deep, resonant boom that echoed through the very bones of the defenders. Its primary target was always the gate, the symbolic and physical heart of a castle's defense. But a skilled commander would also use it against sections of wall already weakened by trebuchet fire, probing for any point of structural failure. The operation was a tense, coordinated ballet under pressure. While the crew inside worked the ram, others might be using the cover of the same shed to pick at the masonry with tools, or soldiers with shields would form a protective tortoise formation around the structure, deflecting missiles. The defenders, of course, fought back with everything they had, trying to set the hide cover alight, dropping massive stones to break its roof, or using hooks to try and grapple the ram itself. It was a brutal, intimate struggle happening in the shadow of the walls, a far cry from the distant arc of a catapult stone, where the determination of a few dozen men in a wooden shed could literally shake the foundations of stone. While the battering ram knocked at the gate, another machine sought to step over the wall entirely. This was the siege tower or belfry, a rolling fortress that represented the pinnacle of offensive ambition and resource expenditure. Constructing one was a statement of absolute intent. It was not a tool for a subtle blockade, but a declaration that the walls would be stormed face to face. These structures were colossal, often as tall as the castle's own battlements, requiring thousands of man-hours and the felling of entire forests. Their design was a direct answer to every defensive feature. The base was wide and stable to prevent tipping, mounted on massive, solid wooden wheels that inched forward over prepared tracks. The entire front face, the side that would meet the wall, was covered in thick, fire-resistant materials. Fresh animal hides soaked in water or vinegar were nailed over wooden planks, and sometimes even raw clay or iron plates were added. This armored skin was meant to deflect arrows and, most crucially, withstand the torrent of fire that defenders would inevitably pour down upon it. Inside, the tower was a vertical assault corridor. It was divided into multiple stories connected by ladders. Each level was packed with soldiers waiting in the dark, stifling interior for their moment. The top floor opened onto a protected platform crowned with its own battlements. From here, archers and crossbowmen could trade fire with the defenders on the wall walks, attempting to clear a landing zone. The final, terrifying component was the drawbridge. This was a hinged gangway that extended from the top platform, dropping down to bridge the gap between the tower and the castle's wall walk. When that bridge crashed down, it transformed the siege in an instant. No longer were attackers struggling up ladders from the deadly ground below. They now had a direct, elevated pathway from their own fortified position onto the very heart of the castle's defenses. It allowed a concentrated flow of armored knights to spill directly onto the battlements, turning the defenders' greatest advantage, the high wall, into a level battlefield. The movement of a siege tower was a slow, suspenseful spectacle. Teams of men, oxen, or even internal capstans would heave it forward, inch by agonizing inch, while defenders unleashed every available projectile to stop it. Its approach was a psychological event, a shadow falling across the stones, signaling that the final, brutal phase of the siege was at hand. While towers rolled and rams thundered, a far quieter, more insidious war was being waged beneath the feet of everyone involved. This was the deadly art of mining, a clandestine operation that turned the very earth under the castle into a weapon. It was not a job for common soldiers, but for specialist miners, often recruited from regions known for their metalworks and tunneling expertise. These men were the siege shadow army, working in a world of absolute darkness and constant danger. Their objective was deceptively simple: to dig a tunnel from their own lines, underneath the castle's formidable ditch and walls, and reach the foundation stones. The engineering was precise. The tunnel, or mine, had to be carefully shored up with wooden timbers to prevent a catastrophic collapse on the miners themselves. Once they reached directly beneath a wall or a tower, they would excavate a large chamber, again supporting it with a wooden framework. This was the trap. When the chamber was ready, the final, terrifying phase began. The miners would pack the space with combustible material, brushwood, timber, and fat. Then they would retreat, lighting a slow fuse as they went. The fire would burn away the wooden supports, causing the chamber to collapse, and with its foundation suddenly gone, the massive weight of the stone wall above would have nothing to hold it. It would crumble inward, creating a chaotic, sloping breach for attacking troops to storm. But mining was not only for collapse. Smaller, stealthier tunnels could be dug to emerge secretly within the castle grounds, allowing a small band of elite soldiers to infiltrate and open a gate from the inside, a tactic that could end a siege in a single, shocking night. The psychological impact was profound. Defenders on the walls would know the miners were at work, hearing the faint, ominous sounds of picking echoing up from the ground, a reminder that their greatest strength was being undermined from below. They lived with the dread that the very stones they stood upon could disappear in a roar of dust and flame. This invisible threat demanded an equally shadowy defense, a desperate gambit that turned the tunnels into a subterranean battlefield. The silence of the mining war was shattered by a far more visible and visceral horror. While sappers worked in the dark, another branch of siegecraft aimed to turn the very air into a weapon, using fire not just as a tool but as a terror. This was the realm of incendiary warfare, where chemistry and cruelty combined to break the defender's will through sheer, uncontrollable panic. The most legendary of these weapons was a substance that has never been fully rediscovered, a liquid fire that seemed to defy nature itself. Known to history as Greek fire, this concoction was a closely guarded state secret of the Byzantine Empire. Contemporary accounts describe a sticky, gelatinous liquid that clung to whatever it touched, whether wood, stone, or flesh. Most terrifyingly, it was said to burn even on water, making it nearly impossible to extinguish. It was deployed through specialized bronze tubes or siphons, mounted on ships or castle walls, projecting a roaring stream of flame that could engulf an entire siege engine or set a wooden hoarding ablaze in moments. The psychological impact was devastating. Facing a fire that water could not quench shattered the fundamental logic of defense, creating a primal, unanswerable fear. But you did not need a state secret to wield fire's power. More commonly, armies used a variety of incendiary projectiles. Clay pots filled with pitch, tar, animal fat, and quicklime would be heated and launched from catapults. Upon impact, they would shatter, spreading a burning, sticky mess that was difficult to contain. Fire arrows, their tips wrapped in oil-soaked cloth, rained down on wooden roofs and storage buildings, aiming to destroy precious supplies and light up the night with pillars of smoke that choked and disoriented the defenders. The tactics could be brutally simple yet effective. One chronicle describes defenders pouring heated sand down onto attackers. The fine, scalding grains would seep through the gaps in armor, causing immense discomfort and distraction, a humble but ingenious use of basic materials. Smoke itself was a weapon. By creating large, dense fires upwind of a fortress, attackers could blind the archers on the walls and make every breath a struggle, degrading the defenders' ability to fight and their will to endure. This was warfare that targeted the senses and the spirit. The crackle of spreading flame, the acrid smell of burning pitch, the blinding, choking clouds, they all worked together to transform a fortified stronghold from a place of safety into a terrifying, inescapable trap. It was a clear, brutal message: surrender or be consumed by an element you cannot control. All that fire and thunder ultimately converged on one small, critical space. The gatehouse was the castle's clenched fist and its exposed throat, a paradox of immense strength and fatal vulnerability. It had to be strong enough to withstand a direct, sustained assault, yet it was the only practical entry point for friends, supplies, and commerce. This made it the focal point of the entire siege, a magnet for both brute force and cunning deception. The frontal assault was a symphony of coordinated violence. While a great covered ram might hammer at the main doors, smaller teams would use iron-tipped borers, essentially giant manual drills, to pierce the wood around the locks and hinges, trying to weaken the structure point by point. Archers on the walls would lay down a suppressing fire, and men with axes would rush forward between swings of the ram to chop at the splintering timber. It was close, brutal, and terrifyingly loud work, conducted under a constant rain of missiles, boiling liquids, and burning oil from the murder holes above. The attackers knew that if they could break through that final barrier, the heart of the castle lay open, but breaking a gate wasn't always about breaking the wood. Sometimes it was about breaking the routine. The most coveted prize for any attacker was an open gate, even for a moment. This led to a shadow game of ruses and psychological ploys. A classic tactic was the feigned retreat. An attacking force would launch a fierce but brief assault on one section of the wall, then suddenly break and run, appearing to flee in disarray. The hope was that the elated defenders, believing they had won a skirmish, might grow careless. Perhaps they would open a sally port, a small side gate, to pursue the fleeing enemy or to send out a party to scavenge abandoned equipment. In that moment of lowered vigilance, a hidden reserve of elite soldiers would surge from concealment and sprint for the open doorway, fighting to hold it just long enough for the main army to turn back and charge. Other tricks played on human nature. Commanders might attempt to bribe a disgruntled gatekeeper or a sentry, a dangerous gamble that could end a siege overnight if successful, but could just as easily be a trap. There are even accounts of attackers disguising themselves as reinforcements from a friendly lord, or as simple peasants delivering a cart of goods, trying to get a wheel strategically stuck in the gateway to prevent the doors from closing. These deceptive plays were the ultimate high-risk, high-reward maneuvers. They required precise timing, flawless communication, and a deep understanding of the defender's mindset. A failed ruse meant the loss of valuable troops and a serious blow to morale, but a successful one could transform a months-long stalemate into a sudden, decisive victory before the sun had even set, proving that in siege warfare, the sharpest weapon was often not a battering ram but a clever lie. The gatehouse stood as a final test of courage, but the most devastating breaches often happened in the mind long before the wood splintered. Beyond the roar of catapults and the shudder of rams, a quieter, more corrosive war was always being waged, a battle for the spirit of everyone trapped inside those walls. This was psychological warfare, and its weapons were fear, doubt, and despair. Commanders knew that a garrison that believed in its cause and its comrades could endure incredible hardship. So the goal became to shatter that belief. One of the most brutal, direct methods was the manipulation of the dead. An attacking army might display the remains of captured soldiers or unfortunate locals on stakes or gibbets within clear view of the battlements. This grim spectacle was not just an act of cruelty, it was a calculated message. It was a visual promise of the fate that awaited all who continued to resist, a daily reminder of the power arrayed against them. Similarly, the launch of a single, terrible projectile over the wall, such as the head of a captured knight or a known ally, was a shock tactic designed to paralyze a community with grief and terror in an instant. The intent was to demonstrate that the outside world was lost, that hope itself was being dismantled piece by piece, but the assault on the senses was constant and varied. The relentless day and night bombardment from siege engines served a dual purpose. Yes, it damaged walls, but its thunderous, unpredictable noise was also a form of torture. It denied sleep, frayed nerves, and created an atmosphere of perpetual anxiety where no moment felt safe. This sensory overload wore down resilience as effectively as any ration shortage. Perhaps the most insidious tactics, however, targeted trust itself. Agents might spread rumors among the townsfolk that their lord had already secretly surrendered or that a relieving army had been defeated. More elaborate schemes involved forging letters, seemingly from a trusted ally or even from within the defender's own chain of command, suggesting betrayal or advising surrender. The mere whisper of treason could be more destructive than a trebuchet stone. It turned neighbor against neighbor, soldier against knight, breeding a climate of paranoia that poisoned cooperation. In this shadow war, the strongest walls were meaningless. The real fortress was the collective will of the people, and every act of terror, every forged note, every thunderous night was a pickaxe swinging against that invisible, vital defense. Amidst the thunder of engines, the true tempo of a siege was set by a sharper, more constant sound, the hiss and thud of arrows. While trebuchets hammered the walls and miners worked below, the skies belonged to the archer and the crossbowmen. These missile troops were the unsung conductors of the battlefield, controlling movement, dictating terms, and turning open ground into a lethal no-man's land. For the defender perched high on a wall walk, the bow was an instrument of supreme advantage. From that elevated position, he could rain down arrows on the workers building siege engines, the crews hauling a battering ram, or any soldier careless enough to step from cover. His role was one of constant harassment to make every task for the attacker more difficult, more costly, and more terrifying. Each arrow that found its mark delayed the siege works, drained enemy morale, and preserved the integrity of the stone defenses below. The attacker's archers, however, faced a far more daunting challenge. They operated from the open ground or shallow trenches, aiming upward at small, well-protected targets on the battlements. Their mission was not just to kill, but to suppress. During a critical moment, like the final push of a siege tower or the swing of a battering ram, a concentrated volley from hundreds of bows was essential. This covering fire forced defenders to duck behind their merlons, disrupting their ability to drop stones or pour burning oil onto the men below. It was a deadly game of peek-a-boo played for the highest stakes, where controlling a few seconds of exposure could decide the success of an entire assault. The tools of this trade, however, were a study in contrasting philosophies. The legendary English longbow was a weapon of speed and mass. Crafted from a single, seasoned stave of yew, it required immense strength and a lifetime of training to master. In the hands of a skilled archer, it could unleash a storm of arrows with a rate of fire that could reach 10 or 12 shafts a minute. This created a terrifying curtain of wood and iron that could decimate an advancing formation. Its power was less about piercing the thickest plate armor at long range and more about saturation, about making the air itself dangerous. The crossbow, by contrast, was the great equalizer. Its mechanical genius lay in its winding mechanism, which used a crank, a lever, or a simple stirrup to draw the heavy string, storing tremendous energy. This meant a crossbowman did not need the lifelong physical conditioning of a longbowman. He could be trained in weeks. When he pulled the trigger, the bolt released with a flat, brutal trajectory and shocking force, capable of punching through chainmail and even piercing plate armor at closer ranges. But this power came at a cost, a painfully slow reload time. A crossbowman might manage 2 shots in the time a longbowman loosed 20. To solve this vulnerability on the open field, crossbowmen often operated in teams protected by a pavise. This was a massive, rectangular shield, sometimes as tall as a man, often decorated with a coat of arms or religious icon. A pavise bearer would plant the shield in the ground, creating a mobile fortress wall. A crossbowman would then crouch behind it to reload in safety, peeking out only to take his single, carefully aimed shot before ducking back into cover. This methodical, armored dance made crossbowmen perfect for the static, trench-based warfare of a siege, where they could take their time to pick off defenders on the walls. So while the trebuchet might break the stones and the ram might break the gate, it was the relentless, whispering flight of arrows and bolts that broke the will to stand in the open, to work or to fight. They were the constant, biting pressure that made every other step of the siege possible, proving that sometimes the smallest projectile could carry the greatest weight of fear. But for every arrow that missed its mark, an invisible enemy never did. The most lethal combatant in any prolonged siege carried no sword and built no engine. It was disease, a silent, impartial killer that respected neither high walls nor noble blood. In the cramped, unsanitary conditions that defined a siege camp and a fortress under strain, illness became the great equalizer, often claiming more lives than all the catapults and cavalry charges combined. For the army outside, the reality was grim. Thousands of men, horses, and camp followers were packed into a sprawling, makeshift city of tents and trenches. Sanitation was an afterthought. Latrine pits were dug too close to water sources, and waste contaminated the very ground they lived on. Fresh food was scarce, leading to poor nutrition that weakened immune systems. The water supply, drawn from nearby streams or shallow wells, was easily tainted. In this environment, dysentery, known then as the bloody flux, ran rampant. It was a debilitating, humiliating illness that caused severe dehydration and weakness, turning a strong soldier into a frail victim in a matter of days. Typhus, spread by body lice that thrived in the unwashed wool of clothing and bedding, brought high fever, delirium, and a distinctive rash. It could sweep through a camp with terrifying speed, decimating entire units without a single combat wound. For those trapped inside the castle, the situation was a dark mirror. As the siege dragged on, normal waste disposal systems broke down. The castle bailey, once a bustling courtyard, became overcrowded with refugees and livestock. The carefully rationed food might spoil, and the all-important well could become contaminated by seepage from burial sites or latrines dug within the walls. The presence of the deceased, whether from battle or illness, posed a constant hazard if not managed quickly and respectfully. In the close quarters of the keep and barracks, any contagious illness spread like wildfire. A simple cough could become a death sentence for dozens. The psychological toll was immense. Watching comrades and family members succumb not to a hero's blow, but to a wasting fever, eroded morale in a way no enemy banner ever could. It made a mockery of their fortifications. A knight in full plate armor was as vulnerable as a newborn babe to the microscopic invaders thriving in their own filth. Commanders on both sides knew this shadow war all too well. They factored disease into their grim calculations, hoping their enemy's camp would break before their own. Sometimes a besieging army would even attempt a crude form of biological warfare by catapulting the remains of diseased animals over the walls, hoping to seed illness within the fortress. This silent, stalking threat reshaped the very timeline of a siege. A commander might launch a risky assault not because he believed he could win, but because he knew his army was rotting around him, and a desperate gamble was preferable to a slow, sickly fade into nothing. In the end, the history of sieges is often written in the names of battles and kings, but it was quietly written first in the lost names of those who never saw an enemy, who simply fell to a fever in the mud, their greatest fight being for their next breath. Yet from within those suffocating walls, a sudden flash of defiance could change everything. The defenders were never just passive prisoners in their own fortress. When the pressure became unbearable, they had a weapon more potent than any stone in their arsenal, the element of surprise. This was the sally, a lightning strike from the castle's own heart. While the besieging army was focused on its slow, methodical work, a small, elite force of knights and men-at-arms would gather in the dead of night or at the first grey light of dawn. Their exit was not through the main gate, but through a hidden doorway known as a postern gate. These were narrow, often concealed passages built into a remote section of the curtain wall or tucked beside a tower, designed for exactly this purpose, to allow the garrison to slip out unseen. The objective was never to win a pitched battle in the open field. That would be suicide. Instead, the sally was a surgical strike, a raid of breathtaking audacity aimed at the attacker's most vulnerable points. The primary targets were the great engines of war. A band of determined soldiers moving with speed and silence could rush a trebuchet or a siege tower under construction. With torches and axes, they would set the precious timber alight and hack at its vital supports, destroying weeks of labor in a matter of minutes. They might overrun a forward trench, capturing tools and supplies, or even snatch a high-ranking knight from his tent to be held for ransom. The psychological impact of a successful sally was immeasurable. For the attackers, it was a shocking violation of the established order. Their camp, which had felt like a tightening noose around the castle, was suddenly revealed to be permeable and unsafe. The confidence that comes from relentless pressure evaporated in an instant, replaced by anxiety and the fear of another attack from the dark. It forced the besiegers to divert vast resources from their offensive works to protect their own rear, building secondary walls and posting more guards, slowing their entire operation to a crawl. For the defenders, the effect was electric. A successful sally was a tangible victory, a story of courage to be told and retold within the walls. It proved they were not merely enduring but could still strike back. It lifted spirits, disrupted the enemy's plans, and most crucially, it bought more of that precious commodity, time. In the grim economy of a siege, a single knight's daring could reset the clock, forcing the attacker to start over and giving hope that a relieving army might yet arrive. The sally was the defender's masterstroke, a reminder that even the most imposing ring of steel has a gap if you are brave enough and clever enough to find it. The relentless pressure finally finds a weak spot. A tower corner hammered for days by a trebuchet groans and cascades into a smoking heap of rubble. Or the ground trembles and gives way as a mine's supports burn, swallowing a section of wall into a cloud of dust. Or the great iron-bound gates, after hours of pounding, finally splinter inward with a sound like a dying giant. This is the turning point, the moment the chess game ends and the knife fight begins. The breach is open. For the attackers, it is a narrow doorway to victory, a chaotic funnel they must now flood with men. For the defenders, it is a race against the clock to seal that wound before the lifeblood of their fortress drains away. Their immediate response was a desperate act of battlefield surgery called a ritirata. This was not a retreat, but a frantic, last-ditch effort to build a new wall inside the old one. Soldiers, townsfolk, anyone who could lift a stone would swarm the inner side of the breach. They would drag forward anything and everything, furniture from the great hall, sacks of grain, barrels of earth, even the bodies of fallen animals. They would pile this material into a rough, unstable barricade, creating a second, smaller killing zone within the castle's own courtyard. The goal was to turn the attackers' single breakthrough into another deadly bottleneck, forcing them to fight for every inch of ground all over again. This makeshift wall was a symbol of pure defiance, built with trembling hands even as the enemy's war cries grew louder just beyond the dust. Then came the storm. The breach itself became the most lethal square footage in the world. Attackers, often elite troops promised riches and glory, would surge forward into the narrow gap. They faced a hellish gauntlet. From the crumbling edges of the original wall and from behind the ritirata, defenders unleashed a point-blank hailstorm. Archers and crossbowmen fired until they had no more bolts. Men hurled stones, spears, and the last of the heated sand. The crush was terrifying, a suffocating press of armored bodies where there was no room to swing a great sword. Combat descended into the most intimate and brutal forms, with daggers, short axes, and even fists becoming the primary weapons. It was a grinding, exhausting struggle in a cloud of dust, smoke, and noise, where the advantage shifted with each fresh man who stumbled over the fallen. This close-quarters nightmare, known as the melee at the breach, was where sieges were truly won or lost. It tested not just skill, but raw endurance and the sheer will to stand one's ground when every instinct screamed to run. Victory here for either side was measured in feet and paid for in lives, a final, bloody argument over who wanted their future more. Every commander staring up at those defiant walls faced the same agonizing calculation. The choice between a swift, bloody storm and a slow, grinding blockade was more than a military tactic. It was a gamble with the lives of his men, his own reputation, and the future of his campaign. This decision was a complex equation where time, weather, and human endurance were the variables. The season was often the first and loudest factor. A summer siege offered dry ground for moving heavy engines and longer days for work, but it also brought scorching heat that could parch water supplies and spread illness through crowded camps. A winter siege could freeze a castle's moat solid, creating an unexpected bridge, but it also meant your army was shivering in thin tents, struggling to forage, and facing the constant specter of frostbite and despair. The commander had to ask himself if his men could survive a winter under those conditions longer than the well-sheltered defenders behind their stone walls. But the external clock was always ticking louder than the seasonal one. The most terrifying sound for a besieging commander was not the crash of a trebuchet stone, but the distant thunder of approaching hooves belonging to an enemy relief force. Intelligence gathered from scouts and spies was paramount. If a large allied army was known to be marching to break the siege, the commander's window for a patient blockade slammed shut. He would be caught between the castle's walls and an attacking field army, a classic pincer maneuver that could annihilate his forces. This threat often forced a commander's hand, pushing him toward a risky all-out assault he might otherwise avoid, simply because the cost of waiting had become unacceptably high. Then there was the silent enemy within his own ranks, the relentless drain of disease. As weeks turned into months, the health of his army would inevitably decline. The sight of his soldiers weakening from fevers and hunger was a powerful argument for action. A bold storm, for all its carnage, might cost fewer lives in the long run than a slow decay into sickness and mutiny. And above all these military concerns hung the weight of politics. A sovereign king or a distant council was rarely patient. They had funded this expensive army and expected results, not a report about trench digging and ration counts. Political pressure could demand a spectacular victory to bolster prestige at home, or a quick resolution to free up troops for another front. A commander who chose a cautious, months-long blockade might save his soldiers, only to lose his head for appearing weak or ineffective in the eyes of his patrons. So in his tent each night, the commander balanced these brutal scales. To storm was to trade lives for time, gambling that a single day of horrific loss could secure a victory that months of waiting might not. To starve was to trade time for lives, betting that his army's endurance and supply lines would outlast the hope inside the fortress. There was rarely a perfect answer, only a choice between terrible costs, where the right decision was often only clear in the unforgiving light of history. Yet after all that thunder, the most critical conversation of a siege was often conducted in whispers. When the breach was held or the last stores of grain were counted, both sides knew the end game had arrived. This was the moment for the final, delicate dance of negotiation, a ritual as formal and perilous as the combat that preceded it. To initiate these talks, a commander would send forward a herald or a trusted knight under a flag of truce, a plain white banner that signaled a request for a parley. This figure was considered sacred, an inviolable messenger whose safety was guaranteed by the shared codes of chivalry and practical necessity. To harm a herald under a white flag was seen as an act of profound dishonor that could justify the most severe retaliation. These men would meet in the dangerous space between the lines, often within shouting distance of the walls, to discuss terms. The terms offered were not created equal, and everyone involved understood the staggering difference between two simple phrases. The first and most desirable for the defender was surrender with honors. This meant the garrison would be granted safe passage out of the castle. They could march out with their weapons, their banners flying, sometimes even with the drums beating, and go to join another friendly force. Their lives and property were safe. The second phrase was far more terrifying: to surrender at mercy. This meant placing yourself and everyone inside completely at the victor's discretion. He could, by the harsh laws of war, do anything he wished. In practice, these negotiations were a tense assessment of leverage and reputation. A defender who had fought fiercely and honorably, inflicting heavy losses, was in a much stronger position to demand good terms. His resistance had proven his worth and made the attacker wary of the cost of a final assault. A wise besieging commander, even in a position of strength, often preferred to grant generous terms. A swift, peaceful surrender saved him the lives of his best soldiers he would lose in a storm. It allowed him to capture the castle intact, with its stores and wells ready for his own use. And it established his reputation as a magnanimous, rational leader, which could make the next castle on his campaign more likely to surrender without a fight. There were respected, if unwritten, rules. If terms were agreed upon in a parley and the gates were opened peacefully, a massacre was considered a profound breach of faith that could haunt a commander's name for generations. However, if the defenders refused all reasonable offers and forced a costly final assault, then the rules changed dramatically. A castle taken by storm after its garrison had rejected a chance to surrender was considered forfeit. In those chaotic, bloody hours after the walls fell, the attacking soldiers, having endured months of hardship and the fury of the final fight, were often given free rein by their commanders for a set period, usually a day. This was a brutal but calculated release of pent-up rage and a reward for the victors, and it was the fate every defender prayed to avoid through negotiation. The surrender ceremony itself was a powerful piece of political theater. The defeated lord would formally hand over the keys to the fortress, often kneeling in submission. The victor would then enter, his banners replacing those on the towers. This symbolic act was the true end of the siege, a transfer of power more definitive than any battle. It was a reminder that while stones could be broken and men could be outlasted, The final move in this deadly game was always a human choice, balancing pride against survival and hope against the cold calculus of mercy. The negotiated surrender was a civilized fiction, a door closed gently to spare the horrors that lay on the other side. When that door was finally battered down, the fiction evaporated. The sack of a fortress taken by storm was not a spontaneous outburst of rage, though rage fueled it. It was a deliberate, calculated policy of terror, the final, brutal lesson in the economy of siege warfare. For the attacking soldiers, it was a release valve for months of pent-up frustration, fear, and loss endured in muddy trenches. Their commanders, by granting them this grim license, transformed them from a disciplined army into an instrument of overwhelming psychological pressure. The message to the next castle on the campaign trail was unmistakable and chilling: surrender with honor or be erased. The initial moments after the breach were a descent into chaos. The tight, controlled advance through the broken wall exploded into a frantic scramble as soldiers flooded into the courtyards and narrow streets. The primary objective shifted instantly from capturing ground to securing plunder. Every man sought recompense for his suffering, and the fortress, which had been a symbol of defiance, was now a treasure box to be cracked open. Soldiers rushed into homes, storerooms, and even the great hall of the keep, grabbing anything of value: silks, silver plate, coins, and weapons. This looting was often violent and indiscriminate, a frenzy where the line between taking an object and harming a person blurred into nothing. The social order inverted completely. Those who had been secure behind the walls were now utterly exposed, their safety and dignity contingent on the whim of exhausted, adrenaline-fueled men who had seen their friends fall. It was a total collapse of the world they knew, yet this violence served a cold, strategic purpose beyond mere reward. The sack was a performance of absolute power designed to be witnessed and remembered. Stories of what happened within those walls would travel far faster than any army. They would be carried by survivors who fled, by merchants who heard the tales, and by the soldiers themselves, who would speak of it in campfires before the next siege began. This was the true target of the terror, not just the people in this castle, but every lord and garrison in the region. A commander who allowed a sack after refused surrender was sending the most persuasive diplomatic message possible. He was demonstrating the ultimate cost of resistance. The next castle to see his banners on the horizon would hold a council. They would weigh their supplies and their courage against the vivid, awful stories of what happened to the last place that said no. Often, the memory of that neighboring lord's fate was more persuasive than any trebuchet. It made surrender with honorable terms seem not like defeat, but like a prudent, even merciful business arrangement. In this way, the horror of one fallen fortress could secure the peaceful submission of a dozen others, saving the attacker time, resources, and the lives of his own men. It was a dark arithmetic where suffering was invested to yield a future dividend of fear. For the individuals caught within that storm, however, strategy was meaningless. Their experience was one of profound personal catastrophe. Beyond the loss of property, many faced the heartbreaking separation of families, the destruction of generations of work, and the trauma of witnessing their communities shattered. The fabric of daily life, woven over decades, was torn apart in hours. While chroniclers of the era might note the event in strategic terms, the human legacy was a deep, silent scar on the landscape and its people, a reminder that the true cost of a broken wall was measured not in stone, but in the quiet aftermath of a home that is no longer a home. This grim reality forces us to see the entire, sprawling drama of the siege in a new light. It was never just about stones and timbers, but about the very human capacity to endure, to hope, and when all else failed, to instill a fear so profound it would echo through the ages. The abstract strategies of siege warfare found their ultimate expression in stone and blood at Château Gaillard. Built by Richard the Lionheart on a sheer cliff overlooking the Seine River, It was hailed as the most formidable castle of its age, a beautiful and terrifying masterpiece of military architecture. Its very name meant saucy castle, a boast in stone. Yet in the autumn of 1203, it faced the patient, relentless ambition of King Philip II of France. Philip did not rush headlong against its daunting walls. He began with the classic, suffocating play, a total investment. His forces surrounded the stronghold, cutting it off completely from reinforcement or resupply. The castle's commander, Roger de Lacy, had stocked the fortress well, but he also faced a complication: the presence of many townsfolk from the surrounding area who had sought refuge within its outer walls. As the winter deepened, their food became a critical liability. In a desperate move to conserve supplies for his soldiers, de Lacy made a fateful decision. He expelled these non-combatants from the outer bailey. Philip, adhering to the cruel logic of siegecraft, refused them passage through his lines. Trapped in the no-man's land between the castle ditch and the French army, these unfortunate souls faced a terrible ordeal from the elements and hunger, a grim tactic to demoralize those still inside the walls. The standoff lasted through a brutal winter. Then, with the thaw of 1204, Philip moved to the next phase, probing for a physical weakness. The outer bailey, while less fortified than the inner core, was still a major obstacle. A routine patrol by French soldiers made a startling discovery. They found a potential entry point not on the wall but beneath it, a drainage chute from a chapel's garderobe, essentially a toilet, emptied out at the base of the cliff. In a moment of daring opportunism, a small band of French soldiers managed to squeeze up this narrow, foul passageway. Emerging inside the chapel, they launched a surprise attack from within the outer bailey itself. Throwing open a gate to their comrades, they captured the entire outer ward in a single, stunning maneuver. This was not a triumph of grand engineering, but of observation and audacity, proving that the most sophisticated defenses could be undone by the most humble oversight. With the outer bailey lost, the siege tightened around the castle's inner heart. Philip now turned to mining. His sappers began their dark, dangerous work, tunneling under the formidable towers of the middle bailey. The defenders, hearing the ominous picks below, attempted a desperate countermine, digging their own tunnel to intercept the French. The two parties met in a claustrophobic, brutal fight in the pitch blackness under the earth, a subterranean battle that decided the fate of the ground above. The French prevailed, collapsing their mine and bringing down a section of the wall. The final assault could now begin. French soldiers stormed through the breach into the middle bailey, then used a hastily erected wooden bridge to cross to the inner ward. The defense, though fierce, was now overwhelmed. The saucy castle, a symbol of untouchable power, had fallen in just 8 months. Its capture was not the result of one secret weapon, but a chillingly efficient sequence of applied principles: blockade, psychological pressure, opportunistic infiltration, and relentless mining. A textbook demonstration that even the greatest fortress is only as strong as the will and ingenuity arrayed against it. The fall of Château Gaillard was a clinical demonstration, but the principles of siegecraft could be taken to a far more terrifying extreme. This is starkly illustrated by the siege of Jerusalem in the summer of 1099, the brutal, desperate culmination of the First Crusade. For the European knights who had marched thousands of miles, this was the ultimate spiritual and military objective. Yet the city was a formidable prize, its ancient walls rebuilt and strengthened, held by a Fatimid garrison prepared for a fight. The Crusaders, exhausted and diminished by their long journey, faced a grim reality. They had no time for a protracted blockade. Their own supplies were critically low, and a powerful relief army from Egypt was known to be marching toward them. Their only option was an immediate, all-out assault, a total war where every rule of patience was abandoned for sheer, desperate speed. This pressure cooker of faith, hunger, and imminent destruction would forge one of the most intense and consequential sieges in history. The Crusaders' first frantic attack on the walls was a bloody failure, repulsed with heavy losses. they realized that to take the city, they would need to bring the walls down to them. With time their greatest enemy, they embarked on a logistical miracle under the scorching sun. The key was timber, and there was almost none around Jerusalem. Scouts were sent miles into the countryside, eventually locating usable wood in the distant forests of Samaria. Teams of men, working in relays under constant threat of harassment, began the backbreaking task of hauling these massive logs to the siege lines. Meanwhile, skilled craftsmen, perhaps some who had seen the great siege towers of Europe, directed the construction. They built not one, but 3 enormous siege towers, each a dedicated assault vehicle for a different section of the northern wall. These were not the slow, methodical machines of a patient campaign. They were built with a frantic, do-or-die energy, assembled from scavenged and transported wood, their hides covered with leather and soaked fabrics to resist fire. Each was assigned to a contingent of crusaders, creating a fierce competition for the honor of being first onto the holy city's battlements. For days, the air rang with the sound of hammers and saws, a race against the dual clocks of starvation and the approaching Egyptian army. Finally, under cover of darkness, the crusaders pushed their wooden giants into position. The final assault began before dawn. As the towers rolled forward, creaking and swaying, a storm of projectiles flew both ways. Defenders on the walls hurled stones, shot arrows wrapped in burning pitch, and tried desperately to hook and destabilize the approaching monsters. From within the towers, Crusader archers returned fire, while teams of men used poles to deflect grappling hooks. The fighting was ferocious and intimate. At one critical moment, the tower commanded by Godfrey of Boulogne became stuck in a ditch. The delay was perilous, but his men worked with frantic haste, filling the trench with anything they could find to free their machine. Once it reached the wall, the drawbridge slammed down and armored knights surged across onto the ramparts. This breach, this tiny foothold on a walkway, was the turning point. Once a small force established itself on the wall, they could fight their way along the battlements to secure a gate. The psychological effect was immediate. Seeing the crusaders on the walls, the defense in that sector began to crumble. Soon, the gate of the columns was forced open from within, and the main crusader army poured into the city streets. What followed was a catastrophic collapse of order. After a siege marked by such extreme pressure and religious fervor, the victorious army, believing they were executing divine judgment, descended into a state of horrific violence. The sack that followed was not a controlled policy of terror for future gain, as in other sieges, but a chaotic and total eruption. The consequences were profound and far-reaching. In purely military terms, the siege was a shocking success against daunting odds, a case study in achieving an impossible objective through sheer, desperate will and rapid engineering. Yet the legacy of that day in July would echo for centuries, deeply poisoning relations between faiths and setting a tragic template for holy war. It stands as the ultimate demonstration of siegecraft pushed to its absolute limit, where the stakes were not just a castle or a kingdom, but the eternal fate of souls, and where the human cost of that conviction was written into the stones of the city itself. The thunderous arrival of gunpowder did not just add a louder weapon to the siege, it rewrote the entire rulebook of defense. The high, proud curtain walls and soaring towers that defined the medieval castle, once symbols of unassailable power, became liabilities overnight. A cannonball did not just chip at stone, it delivered a concussive, shattering force that could reduce a 10-foot-thick wall to rubble in a matter of hours. The vertical silhouette that had intimidated armies for centuries now presented a perfect, slow-moving target for artillery gunners. The very geometry of security had to be reinvented from the ground up, leading to the birth of an entirely new fortress, the Trace Italian or Star Fort. This was not an evolution, it was a revolution in stone and earth. Gone were the tall, thin walls. In their place rose low, massively thick ramparts of tamped earth, often faced with brick. Earth was far more effective than stone at absorbing the kinetic punch of a cannonball. swallowing the impact rather than shattering, but the true genius was in the shape. The Star Fort's defining feature was its bastions, those angular, pointed projections that give it its distinctive silhouette. These were not towers for looking out, but artillery platforms for looking down. Each bastion was positioned so that its sides could provide flanking fire along the face of the adjacent wall, ensuring that every inch of the fortress perimeter was covered by cannon and musket fire. There were no blind spots. The walls themselves were now sloped or glacis, deliberately designed to deflect incoming shot upward and over the ramparts, while also leaving attacking infantry utterly exposed on a long, open slope. The deep, water-filled moat remained, but its purpose evolved, now serving as a wide ditch to keep enemy siege guns at a frustrating distance. This new design turned the fortress from a static shield into an active, bristling porcupine of artillery. An attacking army could no longer simply park its cannons and pound a wall into submission. They now had to approach this low, sprawling complex across open ground, under relentless crossfire from guns protected behind earthen banks. The Star Fort signaled a profound shift in thinking. Defense was no longer about passive height and thickness, but about active, overlapping fields of lethal fire. It marked the definitive end of the castle's centuries-long dominance, a quiet admission that the secrets of medieval siegecraft, so painfully learned, had been rendered obsolete by a puff of smoke and a roar of black powder. The age of the knight in his stone keep was over, giving way to the age of the engineer and his geometric calculations, where safety was found not in towering over the landscape, but in mastering the deadly angles of the ground itself. Those silent, crumbling ruins on distant hillsides are not just broken stone. They are the final, enduring chronicle of the siege, a language of scars written in masonry and earth. Every collapsed tower speaks of a mining chamber's fire. Every repaired section of wall tells of a trebuchet's relentless hammering, and the very shape of the land, with its faded ditches and overgrown berms, maps the ancient lines of encirclement. We walk through these spaces today and feel the echo of that immense, patient pressure, a ghost of the calculations that once decided fates. The stories are preserved with equal care in the vellum pages of monastic chronicles and the songs of troubadours, where the defiance of a Roger de Lacy or the ambition of a Philip II is frozen in ink and verse. These narratives, though often colored by the bias of the victor or the piety of the monk, give voice to the human drama that the stones cannot, the hopes, the fears, and the terrible costs. Together, ruin and record form a broken mirror, each reflecting a piece of the truth about this most complex form of conflict, yet the story is never fully told. Modern archaeology acts as a new kind of sapper, not to undermine these sites, but to uncover their deepest secrets. By carefully excavating a siege camp's latrine pits, researchers can learn about the diet and health of a waiting army. The layout of tent lines and forge sites reveals the incredible logistics required to maintain that ring of steel. Even the humble debris of daily life, a broken buckle, a gaming piece, a worn coin, whispers about the individuals caught in the long, grinding wait. Meanwhile, historical engineers have taken the chronicles at their word, building full-scale replicas of trebuchets and testing them. These experiments answer practical questions that text alone cannot. How far could a machine truly throw a 200-pound stone? What was the realistic rate of fire? By putting theory into physical practice, we gain a visceral, thunderous understanding of the power these commanders wielded and the terror they could unleash. Each discovery, whether from a trowel in the soil or a timber frame in a field, tightens our grasp on the reality behind the legend. It reminds us that the secrets of siege warfare are not locked away in a forgotten past, but are patiently waiting in the landscape and the artifacts, ready to be read by anyone who knows how to look. The story of siege warfare is a testament to the human mind under pressure. It reveals a conflict where brute force was often the least effective tool, and victory belonged to those who mastered a deeper, more holistic contest. This was a grand, terrible equation that balanced intellect against stone, logistics against hunger, and technology against sheer human endurance. Every trebuchet shot was a calculation of physics and psychology. Every sack of grain weighed as heavily as a suit of armor. The true battlefield stretched from the drafting table of an engineer to the dark, cramped tunnel of a miner, from the anxious council in a lord's hall to the grumbling stomach of a soldier in a muddy trench. To understand a siege is to understand a civilization's capacity for both creation and destruction, pressed to its absolute limit. These centuries of relentless conflict did not vanish with the last crumbling keep. They forged lasting legacies that shaped the world that followed. Militarily, the lessons written in blood and stone became the blueprints for the future. The Star Fort's geometric perfection was a direct answer to the vulnerabilities exposed in medieval walls, a new chapter in an endless dialogue between attack and defense. The specialized roles of the sapper, the artilleryman, and the siege engineer became permanent fixtures in armies, professionalizing the art of breaking fortifications. Beyond the battlefield, the grim realities of siegecraft even began to shape the earliest formal concepts of the laws of war. The rituals of parley, the distinctions between surrender with honor and at mercy, and the severe consequences for breaking a sworn truce were all painful lessons learned in the shadow of castle walls, early attempts to impose a fragile order on the chaos of total war. Perhaps the most visible legacy, however, is etched into the landscape itself. Those haunting ruins that crown hills across Europe and the Near East are not merely picturesque. They are the permanent scars of this age, stone diaries recording where kingdoms clashed and wills were tested. The very layout of ancient cities, with their concentric rings of later walls, tells a story of successive sieges and expansions. The collective memory of these events, preserved in chronicle and song, shaped cultural identities, fueling legends of heroic resistance or tragic downfall that defined nations for generations. So when you look upon a broken wall or walk through a silent gatehouse, you are not just seeing old stones. You are standing at the crossroads of intellect and endurance, reading the final, enduring mark of a conflict that forged the medieval world and in doing so quietly shaped our own.